All right, so this is Disidentification, Queers of Color and Performance of Politics by myself, Miesha, Jennifer James, and Chris Wilson. So, just some background information on Jose. He was born August 9th, 1957 in Havana, Cuba. And then he died in 2013 on working on what would have been his third book, The Sense of Brown Ethnicity, Effect, and Performance. He was very educated and he earned a BA and, well, a bachelor's associates and a business associates in comparative literature in '89 at Sarah Lawrence College. And then he got his doctorate at Duke University, which Duke University ended up printing his last book, his second book, and then they would have printed his third book. And he was a Cuban American queer theorist using that lens of performance to see everything through. He was a former professor and chair and department head of the performance studies at NYU, the TIS School of Arts. And he wrote about really popular artists, and a lot of some of them were also Cuban American artists, performers, and other cultural figures in that community. And then his work influenced members of Frankfurt School of Critical Thinkers, Ernest Bloch, Theodore Adorno, Walter Benjamin, and then the philosophy of Martin Heidegger. And then through the subject of, well, through disidentification, the subject is able to rework the cultural codes of the mainstream in order to include themselves into it. That was really supposed to be a quote, but it's okay. And then his work, he owed a lot of his work to other Latin feminists like Gloria, Sherry, Sheila, and then Norma. And then his theory on the disidentification built it builds on the understanding of disidentification and the subject formation by examining how minorities negotiate identity in a world that punishes and tries to erase people who don't fit the subject, aka white, straight, middle class, male, cisgender. And disidentification is about managing and negotiating historical trauma and systemic violence. And it argues that the work of queer artists of color is political and will remain political as long as the logic of the dominant ideology exists. And so those were his only three publications, sadly. But at least we got the third book, which he was working on before he passed away. But all three of these books kind of go into the performative lens of queer theory, and then with heavy, heavy emphasis on men and women of color.
So I did the introduction to this book, and the introduction was discussing performing disidentifications. And I thought this quote was kind of unique, so I wanted to put that in there. It says, embedded in much queer theorizing is the rhetorical practice of disidentification, or the ways in which one situates oneself both within and against the various discourses through which we are called to identify. And I feel like that's an extremely big definition, but I know when I was first reading through it that I wasn't really quite sure what disidentification was. And so Muniz insists on a dialect that describes the relations between theory and practice. The practice of disidentification reconstructs the encoded message of a social text. And that social text oftentimes is that over on the side, it says cultural studies of race, class, gender, and sexuality are highly segregated. And so he wanted to have a representation of disempowering politics of the positionality that may seem unthinkable to the dominant culture. So that's that culture that usually is based upon Western European culture. So you wanted to break that down. Identities and indifference. Minority identifications are often neglected or antagonistic to other minoritization positionalities. So they're often seen as um, often seen as something on the back burner where they they're not the norm, they're not the ideal. Socially encoded scripts of identity are often formatted by phobic energies around race, sexuality, gender, and various other identificatory distinctions. These protocols are established through the reproduction of Native accounts of women that always imply a white feminist subject and equally normatizing the accounts of Blackness that assumes maleness. Later on in the introduction, it talked about queer is a white thing, which is a phenomenon in a fantasy. It's reflected in reverse by the normativity of whiteness in mainstream North America. And it's put at the bottom. It said, it appears that there is a deeply seated need for European culture to critically define identities that flood them with discomfort and paint them in a negative light.
All right, chapter 4. Jose Munoz begins chapter 4 by explaining punk in the 80s as a critique of cultural normative aesthetics. Although it was homophobic and whitewashed, it provided hope of subculture for him. He points to the cultural work of Vaginal Creme Davis, a black Chicano who appropriates dominant culture and different subcultural movements through her terroristic drag. She first became known in LA for her punk zine, Bertal La Toya Jackson, and her punk shows with the Afro Sisters, her backup singers. The zine became a huge hit and became a video magazine, and the shows became somewhat legendary. Along with issues of Blackness, Davis also probed into Chicana heritage with her band Cholita. Through my research, I found that Vaginal Davis was born intersex when surgical correction was the default response of doctors, but her mother refused to let doctors operate on her. And it says male on her birth certificate, but her family has always used female pronouns for her. Munoz asserts that Davis's work is a clear expression of a disidentificatory modality of performance that challenges the identification and counter-identification binary. Davis experienced a snow period of her life, which is defined as an assimilation option in which people of color ventured to obtain privilege by associating with whites in various types of relations. Soon after this phase of Davis's life, she counter-identified with dominant culture and became militant while attending college. This is where she learned of Angela Davis, the Black radical, and chose to name herself as a humorous salute to her. She chose to identify with Davis and not the Panthers because her work is intersectional. This was a disidentification with the heteronormative Black power. She used this disidentification and parody here in opening up Black power to herself, someone who is Black and queer at the same time, and in her practice of drag, which had become commercialized, sanitized, and desexualized. Munoz specifically highlights Davis's work as terroristic drag in that it breaks away from the social body that commercialized drag does not. She enacts internal terrors of the nation. Because Vaginal Davis does not make attempts to pass, uses humor, and is homey or country, she is sometimes perceived as performing a clown style of drag, when in reality she is an organic intellectual who critiques culture with counter-public terrorism. One of Davis's many projects, The White to be Angry, is a live show and CD of the group Pedro, Muriel, and Esther, or PME for short. While dropping some of the humor, she uses parody of masculinity and white supremacy in this project. The live show, attended by Munoz, begins with her in boy drag and in military-style clothing, transformed into the white supremacist Clarence and a disidentification with restrictions on cross-racial desire and miscegenation. Her portrayals of these fantasies make her work an aesthetic terrorism. Clarence demonstrates white anxieties such as these in minorities living in urban areas. An interesting note here is that Clarence is actually Vaginal Davis's birth name. She reserves this birth name for the character portraying the state of siege the nation was currently in. Sorry. Munoz calls this performance a tactical misrecognition of interiorized passing because Clarence does not pass as a white person and doesn't even try. Davis also inhabits homophobic killers with parody to dismantle structures of their identities. Munoz notes that passing and disidentification are similar in that they work with and against dominant structures that are used as survival skills when necessary. Davis parodies passing by effectively challenging the white militiaman's identity and white purity using whiteface as opposed to the white's blackface, forcing a white character with a queer black core. Davis's work is viewed as a philosopher's work by Gramsci. Her work unfolds universals in the predominantly white dominant public sphere as well as other subcultures. Her performances critique universalism and the dominant power block. Unlike other anti-gay critiques, Davis specifically critiques mainstream homosexuality, white gay male normativity. These take the form of two songs on the CD titled Closet Case, which critiques a certain aesthetic of gay men rather than a type of person, and No Thank You Please, which critiques the elitist gay style. Munoz quotes Stuart Hall's notion of war of positions, stating that it recognizes the plurality of selves subjects are composed of. Davis's work reveals the clear need for a war of positions. I think you're muted, Maisha.
That's amazing. So chapter 7, and it really got into performing this identity. And what was interesting to me in this chapter is that he really pointed out how sometimes this identity doesn't work for all minorities, and that it has limits. So disidentificatory performances resist the social matrix of dominant publicity by exposing the rhetorical / ideological context of the state of power. There was, he mentioned a place of multiculturalism within the politics of misidentification. And he talked of transgender sex worker turned evangelist whose name is Sarah, well, who went by Sarah, but who also went by Ricardo. And he failed to convert his two transgender friends into Christianity. But Ricardo found out that he was living with AIDS, and he thought that it was better for him to pretend to be a straight man so he can live in some type of comfort and warmth, and he could die there versus being who he really was and being on the streets and dying on the streets and being malnourished. But the thing about it, he traded that, and the church community still didn't really understand his desire for another man. So in a way, he didn't draw a line between that. He separated himself from being transgender and went just to be straight, just so he could die comfortably. But he died bitter, and he died very sad because he could not be himself. He, in the book, it said that he yearned for another man's touch, and that he really just died like sad and bitter. So at what cost was his disidentification? And disidentification in itself is a response to state and global powers that employ systems of racial, sexual, and national subjugation, the patriarchy. And then it's not appropriate strategy for all of the subjects, just like Ricardo, for instance. And like I already said, I told his story, and he ended up just dying really sad. And he sacrificed his true self. But there was also Zamora, who was in a previous chapter. But Zamora was in a different position because Zamora was working class. So she was offered better positions and better opportunities to be represented. And then that privilege really awarded her things that other immigrants didn't have. And then later on in the chapter, we talk about Gonzalez Torres and how he elaborated forms of representation premised on invisibility. And he worked on disidentity, and it was predicted on the transparency and the everyday instead of just more. I can't really see what I put. But Gonzalez Torres, I think he had AIDS as well, but he was also working within the community just to bring a different light to disidentification. And then the radical multiculturalism, that term, it's more of going against the system, tearing it down and rebuilding it. And it's a counterattack for normalization and with a focus on relational and intersectional aspects. And then the public private split that the book talked about as far as gender binaries. Gonzalez Torres, he related to that within the feminist community, but he wanted to use that same theory as a light for the gay community. And then the gay man whose identity was from a vantage point of dominant culture, a don't ask, don't tell type of situation. That is what that public private split kind of left them with. And then he didn't use predictable routes when it came to critiquing the dominant culture. And then when thinking of race, class, and gender, we want to bring intersectionality into the conversation of multiculturalism, but we can't get them confused. Intersectionality doesn't defer analysis that multiculturalism does. It instead insists on a theoretical apparatus that's located in the now of things. And multiculturalism, it has a place for transformative political possibility, leading into policies that could be seen as radical, aka tearing the system down and rebuilding it. That's always seen as a radical thought for some reason. And Gonzalez Torres, he elaborated forms of representation premised on invisibility. And I think I already put all of that. Yes, I did. But for him, being a gay man whose identity was from the vantage point of the dominant culture, it was a don't ask, don't tell situation, but private loss became public once the AIDS epidemic hit. And I remember in the book there being a photo of an empty bed with 2 head prints in it. And someone who would just happen to be passing by who didn't know what that meant, and they had to ask somebody who has dealt with the AIDS or the HIV epidemic firsthand, and then they explain it to them. So that way the personal really does become very political because it's getting out there to other people.
All right, some guiding questions. All right, so my 2 were, how is disidentification similar to and different from passing? And why does Jose Munoz call Vaginal Creme Davis's work terroristic?
And then our other 2 are, can a self or a personality be crafted without proper identifications? And then the 4th one, what are the possibilities of politicizing disidentification with the idea of misrecognition or being assigned to a group to which one does or does not belong? And that was a question that I found in the chapter that I thought was really interesting. So those are our questions.
That's our guy.
Yes. There he is.